In giving birth, you preserved your virginity. In falling asleep, you did not forsake the world of Theotokos. You were translated to life, O Mother of life, and by your prayers you deliver our souls from death. That beautiful icon of the Dormition behind us. Okay, so let's start with questions. Dimitri, you had some good questions last time.
Yeah. This.
Did all your questions get answered?
The other one that I had was, I don't know, if maybe I asked it against it, trying to visualize it when Christ says, "He who endures to the end shall be saved."
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, what guidance can you give trying to comprehend as best one can that statement?
Well, it's interesting. I just saw, or I was just listening to a wonderful tape by Elder Zacharias from Father Sophronius Monastery at St. John the Baptist in Essex, and where he deals with the 3 stages of spiritual life. And so the first stage is a kind of a honeymoon, and you feel really good about yourself. You feel real good about your faith. Here you are. You're embarking on the spiritual life and all these spiritual practices. But eventually, the time of trials and temptations comes,
Right.
and those trials and temptations are really important. And if you remember, also the Lord's parable about how the seed falls on some of it falls on the path, some of it falls on the rock, some of it falls into the weeds, and some of it falls on good ground. And if you look at that in terms of precisely of this question of he who endures to the end will be saved, what it really means is, how do we, embarking upon the spiritual life, deal with the temptation so that we can remain faithful unto the end, so that in that final stage of faith, there's just immense grace in this life and in the life to come, even more. And so I think Father Zacharias is specifically addressing it in terms of a very intentionally lived spiritual life, like a monastic style spiritual life. But I think it applies to everybody, because the temptations come, and the temptations can be very difficult, and especially including the temptations to just give up and just go back to the world and say to heck with it all. It's what St. John of the Cross in the West calls the dark night of the soul. And Father Sophrony also talks about the sense of abandonment by God. Because whereas it can be a real sense of God's presence in the beginning,
Right.
Sometimes He withdraws that. And then there's this dryness and trials and difficulties, and so the point is to develop your endurance and perseverance through temptation. For some of the temptations are very heavy. For others, they're not as heavy. But it's all about enduring the cross. Jesus is a perfect example of he who endures to the end will be saved. He endured to the end. And not only was saved, but he worked salvation for all of us. So it's remaining faithful from the time of your conversion, or whenever you come back to the faith, unto death. And those who fall away, it's a great tragedy.
The temptations would be the temptations of the flesh, or not necessarily.
Oh, not necessarily. Not just. That's one type. But even more of the temptations of the soul, the pride and envy and anger and vainglory and despondency and all of those kinds of temptations of the mind, and the temptations of the ego, to put it more succinctly. And so it can be, it's not just kind of little stuff. I mean, it can be your marriage going bad. It can be a rebellious teenager. It can be losing your job at work, or getting thrown out of your job, or getting thrown out of your house and having it repossessed, or there's all, or being captured, and here we are in this new age of martyrdom, right? With all of this, this brutal brutality being exercised by the Islamo-terrorists. Oops. Let me turn this off. So, it can be enduring the temptations, it can be despondency or despair. So, and it's hard in those times to remain faithful, because you want to accuse God and say, why aren't you there? Why are you doing this to me? All this kind of stuff.
So then the better frame of mind would be to have not why, but for what purpose, then?
To ask?
Yeah, instead of why, because you could get caught up in the whys for a very long time.
Yeah. And we can't know why. And sometimes we can't know the purpose either. But we simply have to accept that it is. That whatever happened, and the question is, how do we work through it and actually grow in our faith, as opposed to be led into despair. So spiritual life is not all about pietism. It has very little to do with piety and pietism. You can be very pious and not lead a spiritual life. In other words, you can go through all the motions and make all the signs of the cross and prostrations and all of this other stuff, but if you're not spiritually engaged, what are you doing? And it's the spiritual engagement that's what is important. I mean, piety is nice; it's very helpful when it's done in the right context. But when it's out of context, it's meaningless. Please.
It reminds me of this question that I always have about the young man, the rich young man that came to Christ, and he said, "All these things I do." And he says, "Well, you have one thing lacking. Give everything you have away." And so the rich young man walked away dejected. And I've read some commentaries that say there's a great deal of meat in the middle of those words. Could you expand on that a bit?
That was the sermon last Sunday.
Yes.
Yeah. But it was, well, yeah, I mean, it's all about detachment from everything that, from the things of this world, which doesn't mean that we necessarily have to give them all away. Some people do, some people don't. But we do have to be detached from them. If I think, I can't live without my Maserati, and I'm going to die and commit suicide unless I have my Maserati, or my BMW, or my fine porcelain, or or my Apple computer, or my iPhone, or whatever. Getting down to.
So it's just things.
It's things. It's relationships, especially relationships that are off balance, and eventually we even have to get beyond our own conceptions of things, including our conceptions of theology, and that's hard. But it's really important because we can find ourselves worshiping our ideas rather than God.
Because of a wrong conception of theology, Christ was killed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that, but ultimately, all conceptions are inadequate. All conceptual forms are inadequate. Because when you're dealing with faith, you're not dealing with ideas. You're dealing with the reality, the person of the living God. And so it's not about ideas, it's about Jesus, the person, and not about ideas about him. Even if they're the correct ideas of the church, even they can get in the way of the person. Now you have to go through the ideas before you can let go of them. It's part of formation. But then you have to let go of them and let that living relationship happen, and the conceptual, but it has conceptual boundaries, so that you know that you're dealing with the true God and not with some figment of your own imagination. So we mature through concept. I mean, it's like getting to know a person. First you have your ideas about the person, and you're relating to your ideas about the person, and what that person is like, and what that person would be like, and and all the whole gamut, from sensual ideas to the intellectual ideas, and then. And even in the midst of a relationship, often people are dealing with conceptual images of the other as opposed to the other person themselves. And so you've got to get beyond those conceptual images because they're always inadequate, right? Just like any other relationship. That's why marriages are so difficult, because for the first couple of years, the couple are dealing just with conceptual images of one another and projecting all of these ideas on the other, and they don't fit. It's my idea of my wife instead of my wife. So, and the same thing with God. No, we have to have an idea of who God is, and so that's where the church is dogmatic. Structures keep us in line. So.
But isn't that also something to do with the ego? I think you have to be able to drop the ego in order to reach into the other. be it God or even other people.
Right. Well, because the conceptual images are actually all about me
Yes.
and what I want God to be or what I want the other person to be. And my ideas about that. Well, who cares? Quite frankly. Sorry. But who cares? The point is not to have these conceptual images of the other person. The point is to have the actual communion with the other person.
Yeah, exactly. You have to drop a little of yourself in order to do that.
Well, you have to drop yourself totally.
Yeah, exactly.
And especially in communion with God, you have to let yourself go completely in order to find your true self. Because the ego is the false self, and you have to let the false self go in order for the true self, which is apophatic, which is unknown, to actually manifest itself. Because our ego is our conceptual image of ourself. So it's our false self relating to other people's false selves, and that's what the world is. It's this clash of egos, this clash of the false selves, and nobody being real.
Is it necessary to find that real self in order to let go of the false self?
Only by letting go of the false self can you find the real self.
So don't get it backwards.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I think in a way, at least this has been something I feel I've discovered. I've become who I really am in relation to others.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's the nature of personhood,
Yeah.
instead of individualism, which is self-defined. And that's why individualism is ultimately ego-centered.
But then comes the question of how do you do that?
Well,
prayer is one way.
it's
Prayer
silence.
is real. Yes.
Prayer and
exactly.
silence.
Yes, exactly.
Prayer and
Prayer,
Silence.
Yeah, prayer and
silence.
silence.
I thought you
Deep-
said silence.
Deep inner silence.
Yeah.
Being able to say to your thoughts, shut up. Say to your mind, shut up. I'm not interested in you. Not right now. And then then you can begin to deal with the true. Then you can, in an unmediated, unfiltered way, begin to deal with the reality of God. So.
Well, you've said that a pious person can have piety but without spirituality, true spirituality. But can it be, what would you say about the opposite? Can a highly spiritual Christian person lack external piety?
How about St. Basil the Blessed, who sat naked on the steps of the Protection Cathedral in Moscow, eating sausages on Good Friday, while people were going into pray.
Yeah, I would say that maybe he had some piety which was not visible to everybody else. He could pray at the same time. So,
Right. Real piety is not for show. Real piety is a deeper matter between oneself and God.
so piety is not only helpful but is actually necessary and mandatory to have.
Right.
You cannot have high spirituality without piety.
Right.
But piety can be not external, can be there's no one inside you.
Right. Yeah. Well, no, it does have external forms, but unless it has the internal content, people can go through all the external forms. how can in Russia they say that 80% of the population claims to be Orthodox and 60% and 40% claim to be atheist?
Yeah, because atheists are also baptized.
What's that?
Atheists are also baptized in Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're baptized, but
Yeah.
but it's, you know, to what end? You know, you know, if they don't believe, you know, they can go through all the forms, you know, that they want to, but it's not going to save them. You know, just going in and lighting candles, and my spiritual father said, and saying, I believe that, instead of I don't believe that. I mean, it's like, okay, it's better to believe that there's something than that there's nothing. But what's the content of the faith? And so Christianity is not about, you know, there's no salvation simply by association. Just because you're baptized, if you don't believe, the baptism is actually under your condemnation. That's a very serious thing. If you don't believe that Jesus is Christ, and if you don't believe in God, and you don't accept salvation, why should anyone be baptized? Or why should they be baptized? As a social thing. So they can wear a piece of jewelry. You know? Doesn't make any sense. So the point is that people need to be evangelized first before they're baptized. They need to understand the gospel. They need to accept the gospel. They need to accept faith in Christ and open themselves to that faith in Christ and learn about their faith rather than just be baptized. Then they can be baptized. It's a huge problem in Russia. The clergy talk about quite extensively. It's this whole problem of catechism. Because a lot of people are totally uncatechized.
Majority, actually.
What?
Majority.
The majority, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the church is trying as hard as it can, but it's going to take several generations before the society comes back to faith, I think. And as the leadership has, that's the direction, the goal that's set, but it's going to take a long time to work it through. So, any other questions at this point? Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about the liturgy tonight. We talked about monasticism, how monasticism formed, how there were monks. The monks, people went out into the desert. Some of them became hermits. Some of them lived in huge communities. That community type of monasticism spread all over the Roman Empire. And largely it was because St. Athanasius, who was one of the great bishops of Alexandria, who had been exiled 5 times. He was thrown out of being patriarch. One of those times he went down down the Nile to hang out with St. Anthony, the great hermit. And he wrote the book, The Life of St. Anthony, which became a bestseller in the Roman Empire. And literally thousands of people left the world and went into the deserts or into the wilderness, either to become hermits or to join monasteries. The next major, so there was St. Anthony, and he was the pioneer of the hermit life. Then there was St. Pachomius, who was the pioneer of the community life. And they also were in Egypt. And St. Pachomius had communities of up to 10,000 people. Men on one side of the river and women on the other. And lots of crocodiles in between. But the communities, of course, supported one another. This kind of community monasticism became one of the major contexts for the development of the liturgy. In the monastery, for the hermits, most of them were very simple people who couldn't read, and so that's where the Jesus Prayer developed. First, it wasn't the Jesus Prayer as we know it. Many would say single verses from Psalms in a repetitive way, like "O Lord." Then one of the most popular was, "O Lord, make haste to save me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Make speed to help me," which was repeated over and over again as a meditative prayer. Eventually, the Jesus Prayer as we know it developed, and for the monastics who were in the caves and in the living solitary lives, they occupied themselves with that because most likely they didn't know the Psalter and they couldn't read. Now, in the larger monasteries, the way they developed as a movement spread. By the time you get to St. Basil in the 380s, in the 360s and 370s, he had these communities all over. He was based in Caesarea of Cappadocia in Asia Minor, and most of these communities operated hospitals or hospices or orphanages. It's total social action. They're totally dedicated to social action. And so he wrote his rule for monks in that context, addressed to these people who were involved in active ministries, mostly in urban settings. And he didn't like hermits. Yeah, he said he thought it was a totally selfish thing. And who is there if you fall into despair to help lift you up? So St. Basil didn't like the eremitic life, but the way things evolved, there was always a mixture between the eremitic life and the community life, and so as you got into the 5th century. You had St. John Cassian, who, like Basil, had gone on a pilgrimage throughout all these monasteries all over in Egypt and other places, and wrote down his discussions with the spiritual fathers. So you have the conferences, and then you have essentially the rule of John Cassian. And this was taken to the West, written or translated into Latin, and then became an overwhelming influence in the development of monasticism in the West. Also in Jerusalem, St. Helena found the true cross, I believe, around 330 or thereabouts. Jerusalem and the Emperor Constantine poured vast amounts of money into Jerusalem. To create, because she found the site of the crucifixion, the grave of Christ, and the cross, and so these huge pilgrimage sites were erected, and monasteries developed all over the area. Now, initially Jerusalem and most of the Syriac-speaking areas, because that was what was up through Antioch and Damascus, and then into Palestine and east. The emphasis in monasticism was on a more eremitic form. But with the development of Jerusalem as a pilgrimage center, there were monasteries which emphasized social action. And so these hostels for pilgrims and all of this kind of stuff. and with this whole thing came the development of cathedrals in the cities. And so basically the liturgy has two primary sources, from the monasteries and from the cathedrals. At this time also was the beginning of parishes, because up until the until Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire in 381 by Theodosius, the Christians constituted smaller primary communities where there was only one liturgy in a city on a Sunday, led by the bishop and with all the Christians communing in that one liturgy. This no longer became feasible, and so the bishop would send out presbyters to officiate at the liturgy for all of these smaller communities, which is where parishes came into being, and where the priests were presbyters, who were initially basically just the parish council, took over the role of pastoral leadership in the local communities. By this time, the empire was building huge cathedrals in the cities. And so the liturgical rites were developed based on the earlier foundations, with the ethos of the fundamental ethos of on earth as it is in heaven. That the worship of the earthly church should be done like it is in heaven. And so, because that's what worship is, it's identification with Christ's own worship of the Father, and that He leads as the cosmic high priest. And so, even in the Gospel of St. John, you have a very sophisticated liturgical vision. And if you think about it, you all know John 4, or Revelation chapter 4. I researched. Is there an English Bible? What's that?
We're Orthodox, we don't read Revelation.
That's right.
That's right.
Oh, thank
We don't read Revelation. Why? That's what you
you.
do.
It's not read liturgically.
Oh,
Yeah.
no.
It's not the gospel readings.
Chapter 4. After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders, read presbyters, sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Okay, so you have a throne. We call our altar table the throne in an Orthodox church. And with 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne. 7 branch candles, right? There are 7 candles. And surrounding it, the 24 priests. No, that's a big liturgy. And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne, around the throne, were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and back. The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they did not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. What do we sing?
Almost exactly.
Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts, of Sabaoth. Heaven and earth are full of thy glory, Hosanna in the highest. We sing the same thing. Or, Holy God, holy, mighty, holy, immortal. The thrice holy hymn. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him, in other words, make a prostration, who sits on the throne, and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive honor and glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. And so forth. Anyway, it's the book of Revelation. It uses a liturgical vision to represent a vision of heaven. And so the liturgical vision of the church presents to us a vision of heaven. That's what the liturgy does. That's what the liturgy is. It's the core of it. And the high priest, or the priest, the bishop, or the priest is actually an image of Christ presiding at the eternal throne of the Father in heaven. So that's the underlying ethos. That's the underlying vision. It's deep. There's this idea that floating around that Christian liturgy came out of the synagogue. Well, that's not true. It came out of the temple. And the two are very different. And the sources are very different. The synagogue is a creation of Judaism that came out of the Babylonian exile. The temple is a much earlier layer and had this same liturgical vision of on earth as it is in heaven. Whereas the synagogue basically, it's like the first part of our service, the liturgy of the word. You know, there's a couple of some psalms, there's and there's readings, and there's a commentary. That's a synagogue service. Well, that's also our service. But the liturgical, but that's only part of the service, because the other half is the liturgy of the faithful, the liturgy that leads us into communion with God. In a sense, there's two communions. There's the communion in the Word, which is represented by the sermon and by everybody's understanding, hearing the Word of God being spoken to them and interpreted to them by the preacher. That's the first act of communion. And it has a trisagion preceding it, right? Holy, 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 holy God, holy, mighty, holy, immortal. Then there's the second act of communion, which also has a trisagion preceding it. Holy, 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 holy Lord of Sabaoth, right? And in which we enter into this experience of communion with the Father through the self-offering of Christ, receiving in turn the gift of the Holy Spirit, which is then given to us in the communion of the bread and the wine. And so you have this, this kind of initial movement, and then you have its fulfillment in the as we enter into the communion as of the consecrated bread and wine as the body and blood of the Lord. The Eucharist was always at the core of the life of the church. You can read in Acts how the breaking of bread and the prayers were the central act of the apostolic community. As this developed in the churches, even early on by the first century, as we saw in the book of Revelation, we had a very highly developed highly developed ritual of worship. And this, which was celebrated mainly by the bishop, with the presbyters surrounding, and the deacons leading the people. So it was an act of the whole church, but the bishop stood in the place of the high priest and serving with the deacons and the priests as we do today, and offering thanksgiving on behalf of, in the name or actually in the person of Christ, to the Father. So as this developed, it took different directions. One in the monasteries, one in the cathedrals, and later in the parishes. The cathedrals had very grand liturgical rites. Hagia Sophia the first Hagia Sophia was built in the 4th century. Then the current one is from the 6th century. It took 200 people to pull off what was called the cathedral rite of the liturgy. One bishop, I don't know, couple dozen priests, few dozen deacons, 100 chanters, subdeacons, altar boys. So there's this huge company of people, and there would be 10,000 people at a liturgy. Rather substantial, to say the least. That was the center of the worship in the Roman Empire. Each area, each province had its own specific rite. There was no uniformity at all, and so what developed were that there were some major families, as it were, of styles of doing the Eucharist. One was from Antioch in the east. One was from Jerusalem, at the Lord's tomb. There was Constantinople. There was Cairo and Alexandria. Then there was Rome. And each of these had their own kind of specific forms, and they were in different languages. So and then you had Edessa in the further east, in northern Syria, northeastern Syria, northern Iraq. You had Ethiopia develop its own, and then eventually, the Slavic areas even. And so each one had specifics. So for example, Constantinople, because it was the capital of the empire, was kind of synthetic in its liturgical life. It pulled together, its main liturgy was the liturgy of St. Basil the Great, that we have 10 times a year. But then St. John Chrysostom brought his liturgy, which eventually was used because St. Basil is very long. The liturgy in Jerusalem followed the order of St. James, the brother of the Lord, which has some very ancient roots, needless to say. And it was rather different from from either the Rite of Constantinople with the Liturgy of St. Basil, or the Antiochian Rite, which was eventually called the Liturgy of John Chrysostom, and adopted later by Constantinople. St. James was never adopted universally, except to do it a couple of times a year. And the structure of it is different liturgically, and it's just different. In Rome, for the first probably into the 4th century, the liturgy was celebrated in Greek, because most of the people spoke Greek. The Latin liturgy, and Latin as a theological language, developed in North Africa, in Carthage and Hippo and those areas around there. That later spread into Italy among the Latin-speaking people, and Greek was gradually forgotten in the West. And so Rome also was a great synthetic center, and eventually the Latin liturgy of the Church of Rome became dominant within the Roman Patriarchate. There were also liturgies in Gaul and in Britain that were totally unique. Some of them much more Eastern because of the influence of Eastern missionaries there. But they were eventually replaced by the Roman liturgy. In the East, Constantinople was so powerful that it gradually replaced its usage. Gradually replaced the local liturgies that had developed. Except in Jerusalem, they still use the liturgy of St. James. And in Alexandria, they use the liturgy of St. Mark. By about the same time, the monasteries were also developing. In the great cathedrals, they had the first kind of movement of hymnography was in the form of Troparia, which we have now, and Kontakia. A Kontakion was actually what we now call an akathistos. So 24 stanzas, which conformed to, it was a kind of an acrostic, usually on the Greek alphabet. And so it had a very specific form, and it was sung in the center of the church in the middle of matins. This was before they developed canons, which we have now in the form of these, like the canon during matins, where you have a verse that's tied to a scriptural ode, and then Holy Saint so-and-so, pray to God for us, Lord, now and ever, and the little verses stuck between those. Those later grew, and as many more were composed. Jerusalem became also a very, very kind of important center. Not so much for the cathedral rite, because that belonged to Constantinople, but for the monastic rite, which developed in the monastery of St. Sabas. And that's to a great extent because of St. John of Damascus, who himself was not only a great hymnographer, who composed many hymns, but he also assembled from, the vast array of material that was available, hymnography, and put it into usable liturgical form. So that you had a monastic way of doing the services, then you had a cathedral way of doing the services. And then parishes were kind of left on their own to figure out what to do. the presbyters were probably some of the few people that could read. The presbyters and the deacons, and maybe the reader would be probably the only people that could read in the whole village. And hopefully the presbyter could read. Later on, under the, we don't know exactly what happened in Byzantine times, but under the Ottoman domination, not even all the priests could read. They just had the liturgy memorized. And that's problematic, to say the least. But at least they preserved the integrity of orthodoxy. Monastic liturgy was dominated by the continuous reading of the Psalter. So in Egypt to this day, in the Coptic Church, the daily rule of the monks consists of reading the entire Psalter once a day. And that's it's an amazing task. But they do it in a strange way. They'll get all the monks together, and each one will take a little piece, and they'll all say it all together at all the same time. So it's kind of cacophony. But they're all there for the whole thing every day. So anyway, that's not the ideal. The ideal is, of course, to recite the entire Psalter by oneself, and many monks could do that even by memory. The monks also tended to reject the use of hymnography and the use of, especially of the Kentuckians, and of some kinds of music which they thought basically engorged the egos as opposed to worshiping God. And if you've ever heard some of these psalties, that's exactly what it does. Or church, unfortunately, some church musicians, that's a real temptation. So by the 7th, 8th century into the 9th century is when the synthesis began between the cathedral rite and the monastic rite. And there were two centers of that. One was, as I said, St. Sabas in Jerusalem. The other was the Studion Monastery in Constantinople. The Studion Monastery was founded much earlier on, in the 3rd or 4th century, and was known as the Monastery of the Unsleeping Ones, because it had a 24-hour liturgical schedule, and the monks would go in shifts. They'd have an 8-hour shift a day. But the liturgy went on, the services went on 24 hours a day. That didn't last. And so the monastery fell into ruins, and St. Theodore the Studite and his band of brothers basically reconstructed the monastery. And he put together, and with he was both a hymnographer himself, as well as assembled material, put together the books that we now have as the Lenten Triodion and the Pentecostarion, which are the books for during Lent and the 8 weeks of Pentecost. John of Damascus at St. Sabas, just a little earlier than St. Theodore, put together the Aktoikos, and I think probably the beginnings of the Menaion. The Aktoikos being the cycle of 8 tones, which is 1 tone a week, 8 weeks, and then it repeats over and over again, with material for every day of the week. according to the day, according to the theme of the day. Monday was the angels, Tuesday John the Baptist, Wednesday the cross and Theotokos, Thursday St. Nicholas and the Apostles, Friday the cross and Theotokos, Saturday the martyrs, and Sunday, of course, the resurrection. And so that cycles through, and that's the kind of default book for most of the year. You have the Lenten Triodian and Pentecostarian, which occupy probably
considerable part of the year.
Yeah, it's. I think there's 8 weeks, 9 weeks. So probably 18 or 20 weeks, oh, thank you very much, of the year are occupied by the Lenten Triodian and Pentecostarian. And then the rest is done with the Octoicos. Then there's another set of books which gradually developed along, the major feast days of the Church, and then the commemorations of the saints, particularly the martyrs, and then all the various saints who God revealed that the Church held in its memory. And that's and the Manaean is structured according to the calendar. So each day, the 1st of March, 2nd of March, 3rd of March, whatever, has its own saint or saints and set of liturgical texts that are inserted into a standard form, which is called the Orologion, the Book of Hours. Now, the monks initially developed this cycle of the hours of prayer, based on a Jewish model. So there are really seven hours of prayer. You've got the day starts at Vespers, in the evening at sunset, Vespers, Compline, midnight office, and then you have matins. Vespers is tied to sunset, matins is tied to sunrise. And then you have 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours. And all of these have their standard texts. Whereas the Cathedral Rite had its own set of services, a midday service, and matins and vespers. The monastic usage was much more stretched out through the day and into the night. By the time the two finally began to be synthesized together, using the work of these great saints, and from these great centers of Jerusalem and Constantinople, it began to favor the monastic rite over the cathedral rite, and the cathedral rite in the Byzantine usage died out. The last time the cathedral rite was done in Constantinople was in 1204. The last time it was ever done was in the 14th century in Hagia Sophia in Thessalonica. 1204 because the Byzantines never quite recovered enough after the Crusader sack of Constantinople in 14th century. Thessalonica was still a very great center of the church, and it they tried to preserve what was left, but already by this time the Byzantine Empire was reduced to 2 city-states. Constantinople and Thessalonica, and basically after that it died under the Turkish influence, and the monastic usage took over. Monasticism became an extremely important player within the whole Byzantine dynamic of the church. Not only people focusing on their spiritual development, not only people, producing some great saints and tremendous spiritual literature, but also monasticism became the rock and the foundation of orthodoxy, especially during the times of bitter persecution. To the extent that the Islamic conquerors permitted it to survive, it became the kind of place of refuge for the people to go to and for refreshment of their faith, as they struggled to remain Christians, to remain faithful until the end, under bitter persecution by the Muslims. In 15 years, starting around 722 or thereabouts, Islam moved from these little tribes in Saudi Arabia all the way to the Atlantic and up into Spain, and conquered the entire southern half of the Byzantine Empire. There were huge monasteries throughout that entire area, and many of the monks willed and did suffer martyrdom rather than convert to Islam. Many of the lay people simply converted because they didn't want to lose their families. Those that could afford to paid off the invaders and paid the yearly tax called the jizya, which was what conquered Christians were, a kind of tax that was paid so that these Christians could retain their religion and live as second-class citizens within the Islamic Caliphate. This has all been revived now, and the people, the name for the conquered peoples in those within the Islamic Caliphate was called the Dhimmis, Dhimmi. They were usually Christians, though I think they had other religions who were also in a state of dhimmitude, and who had to pay these exorbitant taxes. Of course, the only people who could pay them were the wealthy, and so until this day, those who remained Christians within the Middle East, in Palestine and Egypt and Syria, were the wealthy and the most highly educated people of the population. The poor couldn't afford it, and so they had no, aside from martyrdom, they had no other choice but to convert to Islam. And there were many martyrs, and many refugees. The refugees went to the north into Constantinople. They went into the west, and one of the things that's really important to understand is the Crusades were called by the Byzantine Empire, or they were requested of the Pope as a way to help rescue the Christian churches who had been conquered by the Muslims, by the Islamic Caliphate. You get this whole politically correct nonsense that the Crusades were these warmongering, Westerners who wanted to go conquer these peaceful Islamic peoples, and there could be nothing. There's nothing further from the truth. The Byzantine Empire had lost half of its population, or more than half of its population, and of course, trade was completely disrupted, and culturally, the Muslims would ride into a church and instantly. It would be converted into a mosque if a Muslim went in there to pray. And that's why in many ancient churches in the Middle East you have very low doors, so that the Islamic conquerors couldn't ride their horse into the church. It was an extremely brutal period, but the monasteries survived, and monasticism actually began to thrive. Certainly within the Byzantine Empire, but even outside of it. St. Catherine's in Mount Sinai had been founded in around 550 something, and is still there to this day, uninterrupted. But in the north, in the Byzantine Empire, where Greece, most of Turkey, the Balkans, all were within the empire, the monasteries sprang up everywhere. Within Constantinople, around the year 1000, there were 1 million residents, and 100,000 of them were monastics. 10% of the population. Now, a lot of those were house monasteries, but there were also huge monastic foundations. And one set of these foundations was Mount Athos, which began, I believe, in 947, when St. Athanasius went to Athos, where there had been some hermits before, but it was basically just an area of the peninsula called Halkidiki, which had farms and vineyards and stuff. And he established the Great Lavra. The Great Lavra is probably, a mile long and half a mile wide. This huge monastic fortress. And there are 19 other major monasteries that were all established in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. Many of them representing different ethnic groups.
Yeah.
So you had Iviron, which was the Georgian monastery from Iberia. There was a Latin Benedictine monastery on Mount Athos. There was Romanian, Bulgarian, Serbian. Eventually there was a Russian monastery. This was also the time when Christianity was nascent in Russia, and there was this great missionary push to the north. Of course, the south was cut off, but there was this push to the north. In the 8th, 9th century, Cyril and Methodius were sent by the Pope. They were Greek brothers, but they were sent by the Pope into what today is, I think, Czechoslovakia, or Slovakia. And they began the translation into Slavonic. And there was this huge push into the Slavic areas. And so gradually Bulgaria and Serbia, and then eventually Russia, Ukraine, Russia, received the gospel in the 9th and 10th centuries. With that conversion came Greek missionaries. And that's why still in the Russian church they sing certain phrases in the liturgy, especially connected with the bishop, in Greek, because there were Greek bishops who were these missionaries going into these northern wilds of the Slavic lands. And who created Church Slavonic, for example, which is based on Old Bulgarian, but is its own unique language, especially for church, and translated all of these texts into those languages. And so you had this, this flowering of Orthodox culture moving into the Slavic world, which itself was already quite diverse. But along with the missionaries, there went monasteries. And the ancient pattern of missionization within the Byzantine Empire and beyond was not to send one or two individual missionaries, but to send a monastery out. The monastery would go into the wilderness, they would carve out their hermitage, and eventually people would come and they would relate to the people, and the people would convert, and a small village would turn into a city, and then the monks would flee deeper into the wilderness to get away from all the people. And the same thing would happen. And it's in this way that the monasteries were sent into these pagan communities like Kiev. They would Anthony and Theodosius of the Kiev caves, they formed the monastery, and the people were nominally Christian, but uncatechized, and so it was largely the monks doing the catechesis, both by their preaching and by how they treated people, and by the services. So you had this, and the missionaries would use the monasteries as their bases. So they would live in the monastery and then go out and preach and teach and baptize and found churches, and so it pushed out, and so the monasteries multiplied. And Valam was one of these. Sergius and Herman of Valam. One was Greek, one was Russian or Slavic, and they followed the trade routes up to the island of Valam, which was the middle of the trade route between the Baltic Sea or the central point on the trade route of the Baltic Sea down the Russian river system, and thus a major crossroads had been a Finnish ritual center in the Finnish pagan religion. So people would go there, and Valam became the center for where all of the missionaries went out and established monasteries, but they also went out and converted the pagan Finnish tribes of northern Russia. And this pattern had started very early. This is the same pattern that St. Patrick had used in the 4th century to convert the Irish. So it's a really interesting, I think, an extremely important thing to understand the missionary power of monasticism. And that's why also monasticism has been very much at the heart and soul of the Orthodox Church since the 5th or 6th century. It's where the people would look at the monasteries as the models for how to live a Christian life. And they would go to the elders of the monasteries for spiritual direction, and they would go to the services And in the monasteries, the services would be done well, and they would be done in full. And so people would go to them and use these as models for how their churches should be. And especially since with the with the Crusader destruction of Constantinople, the Islamic conquest of everything up to the Danube, and the Islamic yoke of all of the Balkans up to Austria, the monasteries provided that kind of source of inspiration and perseverance for the people. So very important interplay, and especially since the great centers could no longer function. Like Constantinople could no longer function as the great cathedral of the empire because there was no more empire. Rome, during almost this entire period, was basically a little village living in the ruins of a great city, where there were a couple of big churches, and the church was the only thing going there, but there were 10,000 people living in the ruins of a city of 1 million people. I kind of imagine what Detroit, which is 700,000 people living in the ruins of a city of 2 million. So did this make sense, kind of hold together?
Oh yeah, this is very interesting. Also, it's, one cannot help but notice the likeness of certain trends happening today.
Yeah.
It's something we all have to look at.
Well, the Islamic conquest is a very... there's a lot of lessons for us today. In the days of ISIS and so forth.
Yes. What we're reading about ISIS and its ideology and the way they are behaving is very much the way historically they behave.
Well, it's right out of the Quran.
Yeah, it's just a revival.
Yeah. Yeah, it's how it's to a great extent how Muhammad actually lived.
Mm-hmm.
So there were very few voluntary converts to Islam.
Now that didn't happen though in Russia, it seems to me. But of course the princes went regularly to the Golden Horde to pay them.
Well, they had to pay tribute.
To pay the tribute.
Yeah.
Did that tribute enable them to?
Well, the Golden Horde were the Mongolians, and not all of them were Muslim.
Yeah, that's true.
In fact, there was a substantial number of Syriac Christians among them.
Really?
So that in the 15th century, the Latin Crusades stopped I think they made it to the beginning of the 14th century.
Mm-hmm.
End of 1296, I think Jerusalem finally fell, didn't it? Something like that. Yeah, there was never another Latin Crusade after that.
No.
But maybe late in the 14th century, sometime, one of the great Khans, being a Christian, offered to do a joint crusade to the Pope, where you'd have the Golden Horde from the east and the armies of the Latin West rid the Holy Land of Islam.
Wow.
Never happened,
Never
of course.
happened.
Yeah, because that would have been the early 14th century.
That's fantastic.
So, all these historical what ifs. Monasticism, of course, in the East, as in the West, preserved a lot of the literature but in Byzantium, there were many more literate people than in the West, and the civilization. Actually, the Byzantine civilization didn't collapse so much as it was taken over. The Roman civilization was also taken over, but it was taken over by barbarians who couldn't continue it. The Turks tried to continue as much. The Turkish Caliphate tried to continue as much of the Byzantine civilization as they could, only without the Christianity part.
But it had been given away by that time.
It had been given away, but many of the intellectuals of Byzantium, in that period between the Crusader sack of Constantinople in 1204 and the final fall of the empire in 1453, that's almost 250 years, fled to the West and created the Renaissance.
And all of the wealth, unbelievable wealth, was taken and given away, and the trade routes were given away.
Well, a lot of the wealth was taken by the West.
Yeah.
And a lot of the treasures were actually preserved, thanks to the Crusaders. Let's look at St. Mark's in Venice, which is all decorated with the contents of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So, a tragedy for the Greeks, but it was better that it was preserved ecclesiastically in the West than melted down for the Sultans, you know. It's not a very Orthodox attitude. Not a very Greek attitude. You're supposed to just hate the Crusaders and hate the Muslims. So, should I go on for a few minutes?
Yes.
Please do.
Fascinating.
Okay. One of the very important. This is brought up very much by Father John Meyendorff, who was my teacher at St. Vladimir's, is that there was a very, very strong kind of secular learning within the Byzantine tradition of secular learning within the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. There's nobody who in the Byzantine Empire who would ever have thought to call themselves a Byzantine. They would have called themselves Romans, and to this day they still call themselves Romans. And no one would have been shocked to have been called Greeks, because to be called a Greek or a Hellene meant to call them a pagan. And so they would have been horrified to be called Greeks. But there was Greek learning that was continued within the Byzantine or Roman context of the Eastern Roman Empire. And the educational system was very strong, so that all of the children of the elite who went to the schools would learn all of Aristotle and Plato and all of the Greek classics. Only it would be put into Christian context. So what became in the West these great revelations to people of Aristotelian logic and things like that were what every Byzantine school kid knew, and was told this only has limited application and it doesn't mean anything for religion. Whereas the Spanish got it from the Arabs and started applying it all to religion. which didn't work. And from that you got scholasticism. But that's oversimplified radically. But there was this whole kind of what Meindorf called Byzantine humanism, which really focused on, the great art and artistic tradition, the tradition of literature, tradition of philosophy, the tradition of the humanities in the Roman Empire, and that continued. Even the last pagan universities survived up through the 8th or 9th century, or pagan school of philosophy, and then it all became Christian. But they continued to use the classics and develop their own, and so that there was very advanced literature and art and humanities, but it just took on a Christian form. The humanists being much more, you can't really say secular, because secular doesn't really apply in a situation where you've got a completely unified and integrated culture. But those who focused on the culture as an end in itself basically had represented a very strong element of the society, and they stood in opposition to the monks, who said that the culture was secondary, and what mattered was the Christian faith. And the church was kind of caught in between the two. And then what developed, especially in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, was was a university system within Byzantium. Of course, this was Byzantium was never isolated from the trade from the West, especially from as the West went through the Renaissance and began to revive its trade and revive its culture. And there were merchants plying the waters from all over Italy, and Constantinople remained at the center of the trade routes, and was a major center for trade, especially with goods from the east. But monasticism, as it was developing at that time, especially on the Holy Mountain, became the foundation for the preservation of orthodoxy, as opposed to the humanists, which essentially came to emphasize Greek culture. And so there was this divide between Greek culture and Orthodox Christianity. The monks advocating and pushing Orthodox Christianity, and the humanists pushing, Greek classical culture. Now the divide came, especially with the increasing first with the Crusader conquest, and then with the rest of the Byzantine Empire being swallowed up, and the surrounding Christian cultures being swallowed up piecemeal by the Islamic conquerors. And so monasticism became the most important factor in preserving the integrity of the faith, whereas many of the intellectuals who were more interested in preserving the culture fled to the West, because they couldn't sacrifice the culture and live and didn't want to live under domination of another culture, whereas the monks said, well, we can live under any culture. We're citizens of the kingdom of God. And, you know, Greek culture is nice. That's what we grew up with. That's what we'll keep. But what's most important is our faith in Jesus Christ. And it's not that the humanists were anti-Christian, but for them that the cultural elements prevailed. So this cultural emphasis within Orthodoxy has very deep roots. You know, even before the development of the nation state. You know, Bulgaria converted about 900, and Russia converted about 988, and Serbia somewhere in between the two. But these were not nation states. They were kingdoms that were in relation to and vassals of the Byzantine emperor, and even the West. It was even though the West was viewed as under a usurper to the Byzantine throne, Charlemagne and his. Everything was still viewed in regard to a single Christian culture under a single Christian emperor within a single Christian church. There's no concept of liturgical or of religious pluralism. You were either Orthodox or you were a heretic. You could be a heretic, but that meant you were living outside the law, and you were not part of the. You're cutting yourself off from the society. So, and that's a very important concept to understand. What the heresy was something very, very taken extremely seriously, and that's why the areas that were under the domination of certain approaches to the faith deemed heretical, like the non-Chalcedonians, like the so-called Nestorians, they were actually cut off from Byzantine culture. They were cut off from the society as essentially as dissidents. And so the ties and communication between the two, and especially as the empire became more and more preoccupied with the Islamic conquest, basically disappeared. So that there was real isolation. Anyway, this brings us to the point of having to talk about the divide between the East and the West. And that's a long and complex topic for next week. So, questions? Comments?
I have a question. All this time, what was the Roman Catholic Church doing?
The Roman Catholic Church was one of the Orthodox churches.
It was. It had not. When did it not become Orthodox?
In 1054.
Okay, then I've got my idea.
So it was just one of the Orthodox churches. It was just in the West. And we'll talk about how the concept of primacy and
But after that, it
developed
separately.
Then it became heretical,
Okay.
and so communication was cut off.
And it had to flourish on its own.
Yep. But at the time, the Roman Catholic Church, 1054, you had a thriving empire of a million people in Constantinople. Even though the southern half was gone, they were looking toward all of these Slavs who had converted as as a kind of a new, renewed life for the empire. And there was rich trade coming from the east and from the north, going to the west. And what was Rome in 1054? There was 10,000 people living among the ruins. And and a bunch of little tiny kingdoms that were feuding with one another. It was the kind of height of the Dark Ages. And so the Greeks viewed the Romans as barbarians, and by Byzantine standards, they were. They still didn't have the flush toilets and the running water of the Mayans and the Aztecs.
Oh, wow.
But that's an ocean away. And they didn't have the. It was a very highly stratified society with 60% slaves. That's who the Slavs were. That's where they got the slaves. And so that's the name stuck. Of course, it probably comes from Slav, which means glory. But I don't think that's how the Greeks viewed it.
Greek means slave.
Greek, the word Greek. In what language?
Turkish.
In Turkish. Yeah.
The original. That's why they call themselves
They were
at one time.
Well, Hellenica is the ancient name,
Right.
and but in Roman terminology, in Byzantine terminology, it meant pagan Greek, and Hellenism, as we know it today, is 18th, 19th century.
Right.